Welcome to Issues That Matter. I am really honored to have my friend Robert Meeropol and Anne Sebba, who wrote a book about Robert Meeropol's mother, An American Tragedy, right, Robert?
Well, yes, the full title is Ethel Rosenberg, An American Tragedy.
Right. So, Anne, what made you interested in Ethel Rosenberg?
Well, I could almost turn that question on its head and say, why wouldn't anyone be interested in Ethel Rosenberg? She is an American icon. She's not that well known here, but I think her story really is more important than ever. But to answer your question, I lived in New York when I was a young mother, and I came across a small paperback that I still have by E.L. Doctorow called The Book of Daniel. And I had a son and a baby son and daughter at that point. I didn't know anything about the true story of Ethel Rosenberg, but that planted the seed. I was completely gripped, and I can't pretend I've thought about it all the time since, but something made that seed flower in 2016 when I was looking for a new subject to write. And I thought, this is extraordinary. Why does everybody talk about the Rosenbergs, those spies? Surely Ethel was an individual person. And so I wanted to investigate who exactly was Ethel Rosenberg and not see her just wrapped up in her husband, however much she loved him. I guess there was an individual story.
So, when you decided to write this book, how did you contact Robert Meeropol?
Well, that's rather an embarrassing story, which Robert knows. Um, what you have to do as an author these days is write a long proposal to your publishers and make sure you've got them behind you.
Hmm.
Well, I knew I would as soon as the publishers read the proposal. They were so keen that they did a terrible thing. They made an announcement in the trade press saying that
Wow.
I was going to write it. And I was shocked and horrified because I guessed Robert would have a Google alert on the name Rosenberg, as indeed he did. And he thought, who on earth is this English woman? Who does she think she is, thinking she's going to write this, because I hadn't contacted them first. So I immediately wrote and apologized for the way it had come out in the press. And I seem to remember I caught a plane as soon as I could, hoping that I would. I didn't want this to be authorized any more than Robert and Michael wanted to authorize me. But I felt that I wanted their input. I'm not naturally, I wasn't looking to write something that they didn't like, but equally, I felt we all had to keep our independence while I wrote it. But I was very pleased I met them about 2 or 3 times before lockdown hit.
So, how long were you in New York? How long did you live in New York?
Oh, sadly, only 2 years, but it was a very important 2 years. It made me understand a little bit. We lived in Brooklyn Heights, and we often used to go to the Lower East Side to walk over the Brooklyn Bridge on a Sunday and just try and understand. My ancestors had come from Eastern Europe and they'd ended up in England, but they might have ended up in New York. So my husband and I often used to say, well, what if? So it was a very formative time for us.
Robert, I want to include you in this conversation. So, when Anne contacted you and said that she wanted to write a book about your mother, were you happy? What was your emotions like?
Well, I mean, I think Anne accurately described the first reaction was, who is this person? In a situation like this, the first thing I do is I call up my brother and I say, you heard of this person? And
Hmm.
he says to me, have you heard of this person?
Hmm.
Uh, so, but when Anne sent her apology so quickly and indicated her willingness to come across the Atlantic to actually spend time with me and my brother, and we're talking about 2017 or something like that, and or so I'm trying to remember the exact year, but it was long before the lockdown, so we could have all these face-to-face meetings. And so I appreciated the apology, and I thought, well, what I need to do is to read her books. And we were fortunate that, that she has published books that have been well received and are easy to get a hold of. And one was about Winston Churchill's mother. One was about the woman who caused King Edward to leave his throne. And another book was about how the French Parisian women survived World War II during the Nazi occupation. And I looked at this and I said, my God, this person writes from a feminist perspective. One of her themes seems to be dealing with women who have been wronged and misperceived. And I had always felt that, so I looked at this, I read these 3 books and I said, this is perhaps the perfect person to write this. And Michael and I both agreed, and I can just say that we have never regretted our decision. It's not an authorized biography. I don't necessarily agree with every word that Anne has written, but I think that it is the only literary work about my mother that does her life justice. And that is, I can't say higher praise. So yeah, we may have started out on the wrong foot, Anne, but I think we got it right pretty quickly.
Thank you.
So,
Yeah.
Anne, you wanted to write this from a feminist perspective.
I tried to do that, but I think if I have any particular USP, as they call it, it's probably looking at my subjects from a revisionist perspective. Certainly, I can say that I was interested in what drove Ethel as a mother, because she had this vicious criticism from the judge that she was an appalling mother, and that certainly was not what I saw. What I saw was a woman who was trying to be the best mother she could, a very different mother than her own mother had been to her. And historically, the domestic setting is very important for women, for the women I've written about, because historically they probably haven't been able to get a job. So one has to understand them in the domestic setting. And that really interested me. And Ethel went to mothering classes, and she kept up her subscription to Parents Magazine in prison. And I think that what drove her in those final months in prison, when she probably was clear-eyed and recognized she wouldn't survive, and I think Julius was much more optimistic almost until the end, what drove her really was trying to create the best possible scenario she could for her 2 sons. I mean, who wouldn't be interested, who's a mother or whether you've been a mother or not, in trying to understand a woman in prison with a death sentence hanging over her, nonetheless trying to create a world for the 2 sons she's trying to leave behind. I mean, it's heartbreaking and gut-wrenching, but it's really important to try and understand that. And yet the government was prepared to kill her. I mean, back to your question at the beginning, what intrigued me about this story, it just feels so important that I'm staggered in some ways it hasn't been written about from this perspective before. Perhaps just one other thing, a professor of Cold War history came to a lecture I was giving, and he very kindly came up to me afterwards and he said, "Do you know, Anne, I think we've been teaching the wrong course about the Rosenbergs. We've been teaching how important was the information that Julius passed on to the Soviets. We shouldn't have been doing that at all, or alongside that, at any rate, we should have been looking at what role Ethel played in all of this, and how on earth could the government persist in seeing her as guilty." So I was rather touched by that.
You know, I've had many conversations with Robert over the past few years, and I've expressed my feelings about it, and I find it so unconscionable that the United States government should take the parents of these two small children and put them to death. And, you know, Robert and I have talked, and he's really a wonderful person. And, you know, I'm just so in awe of the fact that Robert is well balanced, even though he had a chaotic childhood. Um, what do you, Robert? Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, this, if we were at a public speech now with an audience, a large audience, you just given me a great opportunity to get a laugh out of them. And I like to get laughs out of audiences, because one of my standard responses is, yeah, I'm fine, but you should see my brother. He's really nuts. But of course, I'm joking. Though, of course, as the little brother, the younger brother, I still like to stick a needle in my older brother sometime. It's just the sibling relationship. But for me, I think it's a testament to something that Anne was saying, that the first 3 years of my life, I lived with Ethel Rosenberg as a very full-time mother. My brother went off to school and I was with her all the time. I don't remember that particularly, but it must have happened. And so the fact that I'm not crazy, I think it speaks to the fact that I had a decent foundation to begin with. I don't think I would have survived as well if that were not the case. But of course, I don't want, the reality is it's a combination of lucky circumstances. Having a good mother, having then adoptive parents who also knew how to handle me and Michael, having a community of support around us, all of those ingredients came together, and coupled with the ability for us to remain anonymous. And that's kind of an interesting story in and of itself, though it's a sidelight about how we remained anonymous and simultaneously had a community of support. I mean, that's interesting how that worked, but it did work and it did succeed. And so that's my answer to the question. I do want to echo something that Anne said earlier too, that about Ethel and Julius, and that is, I can't tell you how many people over the years have said to me, talked about the Rosenberg case, and the Rosenbergs, and say to me, well, the Rosenbergs did this or the Rosenbergs did that. And then I ask them to articulate that. And it's always what Julius did. It's never what Ethel did. So I kind of felt that my mother was disappeared to a degree. And so for Anne, it's not just a question, of revision. It may even be a question to some degree of resurrection.
I would take it even further. You say the degree in which your mother was disappeared, or as I say, wrapped up in your father, or they were seen as one unit. But it was almost as if, because the evidence against Ethel was so weak or shaky at best, as they said, they had to toughen it up So she was turned into the more wicked one, the particularly transgressive person. How dare she jump out of her 1950s box? She was a witch. She was truly, as you'll hear if you listen to Bob Considine's account of the electrocution, 3 jolts would have been enough to kill an ordinary person. The fact that because the government knew they had this faulty evidence, they somehow had to persuade the American public that Ethel wasn't an ordinary person. She wasn't normal. So there was a particularly vituperative attack on her. She was 2.5 years older than Julius, as if that was wicked and that was enough to prove how guilty and evil she was. You know, you have somebody like Morris Ernst who talks about the fact that she was the master and Julius was the slave, this sort of garbled Nietzschean philosophy. It was almost as if they needed to throw everything at Ethel because they didn't have the evidence. So it was more than simply extrapolating her, it was seeing why she had been the cause of so much fury, and the reason clearly is because they didn't have the evidence against her.
Tell us a little bit about Ethel's love of singing.
Well, I wish I knew more. I wish I had heard. I think at one point she did actually make a disc, but I didn't find it, a record. Clearly it was something she was good at as a child. I mean, she was a clever girl. That probably accounts for her mother's jealousy of her. Perhaps even her mother had been clever, but didn't have any opportunities. So it came out as jealousy of her clever daughter. But it's clear that Ethel was musical. She had a completely self-taught high soprano voice. I only know what other people have said about it, but she must have been good to be taken on by this choir, the Schola Cantorum, that sang at Carnegie Hall. She couldn't tour with them because she had to. I am assuming she couldn't tour with them because she needed the money, the wages from her job, and so singing was something extra. But her mother was so scornful of her singing. I wonder if that drove her even more and made her want to succeed. You know, all I know is that she had a very high soprano voice because fellow prisoners heard her sing popular songs of the day. But had she been trained, who knows? I think she inhabited the American dream after going to Seward Park High School, and she was quite right too. Many immigrants of that era who were clever and talented were able to become theatrical performers. But it's, you know, we don't know. We're guessing whether she could have made a career out of it. She clearly had a very good untrained voice and a musical ability.
And Robert, you really like to hear singing like that, don't you?
Well, I mean, it's one of the things that I had a realization of really only in the last decade or so. And that is that there are certain high-pitched female voices that I have singing voices that I have an affinity to, that when I hear someone singing that way, my ears kind of perk up and I'm attracted to it. And it dawned on me that Ethel probably sang me to sleep every night. And for the first 3 years of my life, I was hearing her sing and her voice, and I don't remember her singing voice at all. You know, but I think subliminally, I always have trouble with that word, that it's stuck in my brain and it's still there reverberating to this day. So I kind of, when I hear that, sometimes I get a little smile on my face when I hear that kind of voice, because I think, well, in a way, in this very vague way, I'm remembering my mother.
Mhm, mhm. And let's talk about right now with your efforts with your brother to exonerate your mother. How's that going?
Well, there's certain things I can say and certain things I can't say.
Okay.
Okay. What I can say is that we literally were on the verge of reinitiating the request. Uh, that uh, we had the appropriate papers. We were working with a very potent office in Washington to deal with this, and then Putin invaded Ukraine, and it dawned on me several weeks later that there is no way, as long as what's going on in Ukraine continues, that we're going to get the president of the United States to exonerate a woman who was convicted of spying for the Russians. The
Mm-hmm.
fact the
Oh,
fact that
wow.
it's a totally different Russia, it's a
Right.
totally different situation, uh, is going to be lost on the public. And
Mm-hmm.
so we are in this kind of month to month hold where every month we reconnect with the people we're working with and we say, well, has it changed enough this month? And the answer so far has been no. And I think the answer, unfortunately, is going to remain no. Now, I don't want to martyr myself with this. I mean, it's been very difficult for me because in some ways I've been working, trying to figure out how to exonerate my mother since the mid 1980s. So it's a long time. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, as I said, I don't want to make myself a martyr when what's going on in Ukraine for the people who are getting bombed and slaughtered is so much worse. But so so that has so I wish I could give you a more positive answer,
Mm-hmm.
but unfortunately, we are on hold right now, and we may remain on hold. I can't even tell. I mean, the only solace I take from this is that it's so totally out of our control that it's not like we did something wrong or there's anything we could do to make it right. We just have to sit there and try to be as patient as possible. And, my brother and I are we've repeatedly said, and we're very comfortable saying that we're marathoners, not sprinters. But
Mm-hmm.
we've been running this marathon for a very long time and we're not getting any younger.
So, and when you wrote the book, what was the most startling revelation for you? Or interesting revelation, I should say.
Um, well, I suppose it's the misogyny of the era. I can't say I was completely surprised by it, but as I saw how thickly layered it was, the most startling was the behavior of the judiciary. I think I would have expected better from them. I don't expect any better from my own profession, the press, but I feel the press did Ethel no favors. Her family did her no favors. But
Mm-hmm.
I would have expected the judiciary to do better. And there was so much infighting at the top that I think Ethel was a victim of that. Um, just really the layer upon layer of the whole story of how, when a government is prepared to see one of its own citizens trampled on to the extent of extinguishing her life
Mm-hmm.
because it's responding to mass hysteria. I mean, one knows it exists, so I can't say I was shocked. We all read about the McCarthyite hysteria. I understand why America believed that it was in danger of a communist threat. So, it wasn't really a surprise. I think it was just the intensity of all of it together.
So
It
Anne, we
always powers against one woman.
So, Anne, we just have a couple of minutes left. So, tell our listening audience about your writing. You've written other books and how you got interested in writing books about women from a feminist perspective.
Um, well, I could say there's no other perspective, is there, to write books?
Right.
I mean, the, um, it to see how women have wielded influence. My book about Winston Churchill's mother, I felt that the person who really should be blamed for being a dreadful parent to Winston was his father, but nobody ever blames him. It's always the mother. And she wasn't perfect. And certainly Wallis Simpson was far from perfect. She manipulated the king, or the Prince of Wales as he was when the affair started, thinking she could have a bit of fun and a bit of jewelry, and she got hoisted by her own petard. So, I don't love her, but nonetheless, in England, she's always, or in Britain, I should say, she has always been blamed for stealing the king, but he was the deficient one. So I guess I just like to turn the tables if I can, but not without the evidence. And for women in wartime France, I think the answer is in Britain, we've been rather scornful of French women and assumed that they all collaborated. But in Britain, we were never occupied by anyone, certainly not by the Nazis. I'm not sure we'd have necessarily behaved any better had we been. So it was interesting to look at the many and various ways in which Parisian women did try and resist. And it's just a different story from the one that we're all familiar with. That's mostly what I like to try and do if I possibly can.
And Robert, we talked many times, with interviews, and our time is just about up. This has been totally wonderful, and hopefully, Anne, maybe we could talk about again about if you're um, doing something upcoming that you'd like to share with the listening audience. So you have been listening to Anne Saba. Tell us the name of the book, uh, the Rosenberg book again.
Ethel Rosenberg, An American Tragedy, and it's about to have a new title for the paperback in the UK. It's going to be called Ethel Rosenberg, The Brief Life and Long Betrayal of an American Wife and Mother. But that's for the UK paperback, so I'm sure your listeners will be more interested in the American version.
And
Well,
Robert,
when
Go
is
ahead.
the American version of the paperback scheduled? People might want to know that.
It's scheduled for June,
Okay,
mid-June, I
well,
think.
people can get hardback first editions now, or they can pick up paperbacks in June. But I want to say that if you buy this book, you will not regret doing that, and you will not regret reading it.
thank you
Funny.
both for a very enlightening interview, and have a great day. Thank you.